It is a privilege, a pleasure, and an honor to be with you this evening. A word of thanks to those responsible for all of the arrangements that made it possible for us to gather tonight. Peter, you and your team particularly have been so generous and hospitable and gracious to us. Thank you. And Andrew, if the sermon comes anywhere close to that introduction, I wish I could tape that and share it with my mother. She might even believe it. It's just a delight to be here with you and to gather as preachers and as lay leaders and as faithful Christians, one and all. It's late, I'm aware of that. Most of us have had full days. Many have been to church, some have preached, made pastoral visits. It's been a full and long day. And so that and those early lines from Peter's prayer about the times we often speak when a word of silence would suffice make me inclined to keep this sermon short. But given the things I mentioned, that it's late and it's been a long day and many here are weary, I'm also inclined to ask, what brings us here? Why come tonight or these next couple of days? I suppose there are a lot of reasons. One is that we crave fellowship with each other, a chance to catch up. We may need or look for a kind of pick-me-up and some encouragement. We may hope to have some new ideas about preaching or for our congregation. All of those and many other ideas are possibilities for what gathers us after a long day in the evening to one more service, one more conference. But I think there's another reason as well. As I have a chance to be out and about across the church and to speak with pastors of different countries and regions and denominations, one of the themes that seems to continue to emerge is a sense of concern, anxiety, at times even desperation, a loss of confidence in why we gather and what we do, or if our preaching, our singing, our leadership has the impact we'd hoped or expected when we first took up our call. Maybe that sense of anxiety or concern or desperation has snuck up upon you when you've looked out to see a dwindling congregation so much lesser than you remember earlier in your ministry or as a child. Or maybe it's in the gaze of parishioners and you can't tell if they're focusing on you or thinking about what's to come in the week. Or maybe it's as you look out and catch the occasional dull blue glint, the reflection of a smartphone off someone's glasses. I had my own moment, my own awakening or realization of a certain sense of desperation just a couple of years ago, and it came from a rather surprising place. I was invited to lead a Lilly endowment-sponsored grant that was to help equip the graduates of 5 different seminaries from 5 different Christian traditions to foster a more robust sense of Christian vocation, the belief that every Christian is called by God to render service to God and to neighbor in all of their different arenas of life. The grant sprung from some pre-research, 2 studies that we had done. The first was very encouraging. We were joining together 5 different schools: Princeton Seminary for the Reformed, Catholic Theological Union for the Roman Catholics, Duke Divinity School for the Methodists, Fuller Seminary for the Evangelicals, and Luther Seminary for Lutherans. 5 different traditions, and yet united in a sense of concern and wonderment about whether our people sense God's call in their daily life. And so we began by polling the graduates of our different institutions, in part to determine whether we shared enough common theology to make this work worthwhile, and the results were encouraging. We did, in fact. It turned out that vocation, the belief that God calls all of us through baptism to ministry, was palpable and strong, and across the board our graduates identified it as a key part of their preaching and their teaching. Then we dug a little deeper through literature studies and surveys and interviews. We began to poll many of the people, the congregants that our graduates were serving, only to discover that very, very few of them felt called. Few of them, that is, could identify anything about what they did through the rest of the week as worthy of God's attention or the church's, or saw it in any way, shape, or form as a calling. And that was the purpose of that grant, to try to figure out that conundrum. How can we graduate a generation of preachers with vocation at the center of their ministry and yet foster a culture of Christians who do not feel called? One of the first assignments was for each of the schools. We had different working groups at each school to articulate a brief statement or theology of vocation from their particular perspective. So our friends at Duke, for instance, very quickly wrote a beautiful Wesleyan understanding of vocation, and the other schools followed suit. The team I was with at Luther had a very difficult time doing that simple assignment, not because we couldn't come up with a statement that we felt our bishops would all be proud of, but rather each time we wrote a statement that felt theologically accurate, rhetorically sufficient, yet at the same time we felt ourselves caught up in a collective yawn. That's right, we were bored by our own theology, which cannot be a good thing. So at that moment, one of my colleagues, Andrew Root, who is an astute student of culture, which really means that Andy watches way too much television, Andy suggested that we had agreed that vocation was an identity term. To believe you yourself to be a child of God when called by God is at the root of our Christian identity. But then he went on to ask whether or not we had assumed that Christians today were constructing their identity, forming their identities, in the same way Christians a generation ago had. Were we, he asked, still making meaning the same way our parents and grandparents did? Or as another of my colleagues said, we're interested in how faith connects to daily life. Are we sure we know what a daily life looks like in the 21st century? So we took a break from the formal work and we began to delve into this culture in which we lived and breathed and had our movement, and yet too often ignored when it came to our life in the church. So we interviewed and we read and we watched videos and we talked and we read books and we surveyed, and after a year I had become convinced that in fact in a very short time the culture had shifted enough, had changed enough, that we had a generation of persons in the church and out who were making meaning, constructing their identities very differently than any generation ahead of time. And all of a sudden I wondered whether what I had been trained to do was any longer sufficient. A sentiment I've heard echoed from church leaders across the church: were we trained for this world or the one that just left? I experienced in that moment what I've been describing since as a fruitful vocational crisis. It has spurred my thinking and reading and writing in ways I wouldn't have imagined, and so fruitful it is at the core of my own sense of what I am called to equip persons to proclaim the gospel, vocational, but it has at every single step of the way felt like a crisis, which is part of the reason I'm grateful to be with you for this conference. I am tired of suffering alone, and I am eager to welcome you all into this crisis, for although I am sure I cannot understand or figure it out sufficiently, yet I believe those gathered here this evening that together and led by the Spirit, we can. I don't have things figured out, but I am looking for clues. I'm looking for mentors, looking for examples, and I found an unlikely one in the character and person of Jacob. I don't know if you're surprised by that. I am. Jacob is rarely much of an example of anything positive for anyone through the ages. He's one of those people who can't seem but help to always put himself first. He can't look out for the needs of anyone else until all of his are met. So perhaps even in this reading tonight, he is only accidentally helpful. And yet I think I'm just desperate enough to take any help, accidental or not. A little bit of background helps to bring us to the story, to this place of the story where we found ourselves tonight. You might remember that Jacob is one of two twin boys born to Isaac and Rebekah. And if you ever worry that there are problems in your family, that you have things together enough that you really shouldn't show up and darken the door of the church, read the Bible. Because this family is only one of a long line of dysfunctional families. And we see that dysfunction played out from the very beginning, where the mother chooses and favors one son and the father the other. And little wonder there is conflict throughout the story of this family. The two boys grow up as different as night and day. Esau is a ruddy complexion. He is strong. He is a hunter. He's a woolly, wild bear of a man. He is a charter member of the National Rifle Association. Jacob, by contrast, is the foremost mama's boy. He stays at home, prefers to garden and to cook, to let his brother go out and do the hard work and tend the simpler, softer things in his abode. Two moments in particular stand out in the story of this troubled family. One is when Esau the hunter comes back from a hunt unsuccessful and is famished, starved, and he sees his brother tending a stew, a lentil soup, and so hungry he's willing to do anything, including trading his birthright, which is the price that Jacob exacts to give his brother a bowl of soup. The second time is much later. Isaac now is old, nearly deaf, half blind, and ready to convey onto his eldest the blessing of the family. We often have a hard time understanding why blessing can only be given to one child, and yet in the ancient world it was the full inheritance, the full blessing passed on to the eldest. And at this moment, Rebekah comes along and schemes with Jacob to present him as his older brother, to deceive his father and to steal his brother's blessing. And they are successful in their schemes. And that scene, that part of the drama, closes when Esau returns and comes in expecting his blessing, and his father has nothing left for him, only curses. And the curtain closes on that part of this family saga with the howls of despair and rage of Esau, while Jacob packs his bags and gets ready to flee. It's just there then that we pick up the story. Jacob is on the road, on the run, with nowhere to go, nowhere to lay his head. And so in his own moment of desperation, he lays down on the plain where he is walking and finds only a rock to use as a pillow. But wearied from his life, pursued by demons, external and internal, he falls immediately asleep, and he dreams. He dreams that the heavens themselves are opened up, and there is this glorious ladder, and the angels are ascending and descending up and down. And when he awakes, he says these incredible words that I covet more and more of our people could say: surely the Lord was in this place, and I didn't know it. And he takes that rock that proved, I would think, a poor but apparently adequate pillow, and he sets it up to mark this spot which he claimed is the very gate of heaven, the place where God appeared and touched his life and marked him and made promises to him, this vagabond and cheat and scoundrel, of family and destiny. Persons have been marking the earth with stones for centuries. Most often we call those places cairns. It may be a single rock or a small pile, or may grow to almost momentous proportions. But we have been marking the important places and spots of our lives for millennia. Cairns most often are used for one of three purposes. Sometimes they are put to mark the way, to keep hikers, or today bikers, on the right path, particularly when you are above the tree line, Stones will be placed and arranged or painted to keep you and guide you on the right path. Sometimes we place stones to remember. We build cairns over fallen comrades or at significant places of loss. Perhaps you're on the highway and will see one dedicated to a law enforcement officer or a member of the military services who has died. We mark these places, and they help us to remember the fidelity of those we miss and our own love and loss. And sometimes we use those stones to mark places where we have been touched by God and experienced God's presence and purpose. Particularly in the Celtic tradition, there has been a long-standing practice of marking what the Celts will often call the thin places of life. Those places, those times, those moments where the great gap and distance that so regularly seems to stand between us and the Almighty somehow shrinks and gets small and thin, and God reaches out down and through to touch. And at those thin places, we know, like Jacob, there is only one thing to do, which is to bear witness and mark them, to serve as a remembrance and a guide and a place of worship. These three purposes, of course, aren't mutually exclusive. In some ways, Jacob does them all. He also is looking for a way forward and marks this place. It is a memory of what he has lost and what the Lord has promised. And it is the beginning of a temple. In fact, he will come back and put more stones and more stones until one of the first temples of Scripture is built right there. I wonder if that example, the accidental example of Jacob, might speak to us at this time and place. I'm not through my own fruitful vocational crisis yet, but as I muddle forward, it strikes me that this task of bearing witness, of marking the presence of God, of helping those around us to be able to say with Jacob, surely the Lord was here, and we didn't know it. Perhaps that can serve as an anchor and guide as we seek our way forward in a changed and ever-changing world. We are called to bear witness to where God has been active in our lives and the lives of our community and the world. It was Jesus' command to his first disciples and continues to ring through the ages until we hear that call and pick it up ourselves. Witnesses, it is a powerful word filled with potential. I'd like to share an extended reading from a book, from a passage that has meant a lot to me when it comes to thinking about my own call, our call, at this time and place. It gives voice for me to a sense of what it means, what it might mean to be a witness today. The book is called Peace Like a River, written a few years ago by Leif Enger, a fellow Minnesotan. He begins his story by describing his own miraculous birth, for when he was born, his lungs were not powered to bring in air, and his mother and the doctor were convinced that he was going to die. But his father, undeterred, even after the doctor's protest, he had been sitting there without a breath for 8 minutes. His father came into the room, pushed the doctor away, walked up to his son, and then said in a normal voice, "Reuben, land, in the name of the living God, I am telling you to breathe." And Reuben did. And I want to read you his remembrance of those moments. The truth is, I didn't think much on all of this until about a dozen years later, beyond, of course, savoring the fact that I'd begun life in a dangerous and thus romantic manner. When you are 7 years old, there's nothing as lovely and tragic as telling your friends that you were just about dead once. It made my dad a hero, as you might expect. Won him my forgiveness for anything that he might do forever. But until later events, it didn't occur to me to wonder just why I was allowed, after all, to breathe and keep breathing. The answer, it seems to me, now lies in miracles. Now let me say something about that word, miracle. For too long, it's been used to characterize things or events that, though pleasant, are entirely normal. Peeping chicks at Easter time, spring generally, a clear sunrise after an overcast week, a miracle, people say, as if they've been educated from greeting cards. I'm sorry, but nope. Such things are worthy of our notice every day of the week, but to call them miracles evaporates the strength of the word. Real miracles bother people, like strange and sudden pains unknown in medical literature. It's true, they rebut every rule all we good citizens take comfort in. Lazarus obeying orders and climbing up out of the grave. Now there's a miracle, and you can bet it upset folks. The folks who were standing around at that time. When a person dies, the earth is generally unwilling to cough him back up. A miracle contradicts the will of earth. Now, my sister, Swede, who often sees to the nub, offered this. People fear miracles because they fear being changed, though ignoring them will change you also. Swede said another thing, too, and it rang in me like a bell. No miracle happens without a witness. Someone to declare, here's what I saw, here's how it went, make of it what you will. Might that be our role and calling this day? To surround the people of God with a constant and consistent witness that God is, in fact, active and alive and about the business of rearing them and training them for meaningful lives in the world. Might we be those who are called to bear witness to the ongoing miracles that bother and upset and change and redeem ordinary people. Might we be called, like Jacob, to be those people who mark the thin places where God interrupts the everyday and the normal and draws near to astonish us with grace. Might we be called those people whose job it is to say, here's what I saw. Here's how it went. Make of it what you will. In that spirit, at the end of the service, I'm going to invite you on your way up and out toward our time of coffee and fellowship to take one of those stones sitting up front, one of those stones that Peter was gracious enough to trek out to Home Depot and purchase and clean and arrange in a cairn-like fashion. Take it with you. You are welcome if you choose to use it as a pillow tonight. But I would invite you rather to carry it for the next few days. And when you sense God at work in the ordinary, collapsing the distance, reaching out to touch us, mark that place with your stone. Maybe it will be in your household or home. Maybe at a place of work, congregation. Maybe it will be the local school or outside the premises of an honest shopkeeper. Wherever it is, mark God's activity. For the God we worship is not done and has called us to be his witnesses. Thanks be to God. Amen.